In 1959, a young man borrowed $800 from his family because the music industry kept stealing from black artists. He was so disgusted by the way labels treated performers, he decided to build something better, something fair, something theirs. By 1988, that same man had sold the label those artists built. Without telling them, without cutting them in, without a single phone call, he pocketed $61 million. The artists who made him rich? Some of them were still waiting on royalty checks that were never coming. The man who started Motown to end the exploitation turned out to be the most efficient exploiter of them all. If you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you. To understand the betrayal, you first have to understand the dream. And the dream was real. It wasn't marketing. It wasn't mythology built after the fact. It was a genuine, lived belief that something different could exist. Detroit, 1959. Gordy is 29 years old. He's worked the Ford assembly line at $85 a week. He's tried boxing. He tried running a jazz record store. He's written songs for Jackie Wilson, songs that charted, songs that mattered, and he watched every dollar those songs generated disappear into someone else's pocket. That's not metaphor. That's documented history. Gordy knew firsthand what it felt like to create something valuable and receive almost nothing for it. And that experience, that specific wound, is exactly what he said drove him to build Motown. He borrowed $800 from his family savings fund. The Gordy family ran a collective. Every member contributed $10 a month, and if you needed money, you pitched your idea to the group. If they voted yes, you got the loan. Gordy pitched. They voted yes. And with $800 and a borrowed belief in himself, he started what would become the most successful black-owned business in American history. Now think about what that meant in 1959. This wasn't just a record label. This was a counterstatement to an entire industry that had been systematically robbing black artists for decades. The practice had a name. They called it buying out artists. A record label would give a singer a one-time payment, take the masters, take the publishing, and keep every dollar those recordings ever made in perpetuity. Artists would hear their songs on the radio, songs they sang, songs they wrote, and see nothing. Not a cent. Gordy knew this. He'd lived it. So when he opened that first office on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, a house he called Hitsville, USA, he told his artists something that felt radical at the time. We're family here. And for a while, it felt true. The artists who walked through that door were young. They were talented. Many of them came from Detroit's housing projects with nothing but their voices and the belief that music could change their lives. Diana Ross, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, signed at 11 years old. The Temptations, Martha Reeves, The Four Tops, Smokey Robinson. These weren't just performers. They were the product of a full ecosystem Gordy built around them. Motown had an artist development department, essentially a finishing school. They were taught how to walk, how to sit, how to speak in interviews, how to conduct themselves on stage. Maurice King coached their vocals. Charlie Atkins choreographed their movements. Maxine Powell taught them poise. The idea was dignified presentation for black artists at a time when dignity was something America regularly denied them. That part was real. That part mattered. And the music, God, the music. Between 1960 and 1969, 79 Motown songs reached the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100. 79. In a single decade. That is not a record label. That is a cultural force. Stop. In the name of love. My girl. What's going on? I heard it through the grapevine. Ain't no mountain high enough. Songs that didn't just top charts. Songs that became the emotional soundtrack of an entire generation. Your generation. Songs that played at weddings and funerals and first dances and long drives home. When people talk about Motown, this is what they mean. This feeling. This golden, unbroken run of music that felt like it could not possibly have come from one city, one building, one man's vision. But here's the thing about visions. They belong to the person doing the imagining. And what Gordy imagined was never quite the same as what he told the artists they were part of. Let's talk about the contracts. Because the contracts are where the dream and the reality split apart, and once you see that split, you can never unsee it. Here's something that didn't make it into the Motown documentaries. When a new artist was brought in to sign their deal, they were not allowed to take the contract home. Read that again. Motown standard practice was to present the contract in the office, in the room, in that moment, and require the artist to sign it there, and then. No lawyer. No overnight review. No second opinion. According to multiple accounts documented in music industry histories, this was deliberate policy, designed specifically to prevent outside influence. And these were kids. We're talking about teenagers. Young people from Detroit who had never seen a contract in their lives, who had been dreaming of this moment since they were 8 years old, who were sitting in the office of the most exciting record label in America, and being handed a stack of papers and a pen. What would you have done? You would have signed. Of course you would have signed. Because the alternative was walking away from the only door that had ever opened for you. So they signed. And what they signed away was staggering. The standard artist royalty rate at Motown was 2.7%. Not 10%. Not 15%. 2.7% on net sales after recording costs had been recouped. And here's the part that makes that number even more brutal. That 2.7% wasn't per person. That was the group's total. So the four tops split 2.7% 4 ways. The Temptations split it 5 ways. You could have a top 5 record, a song playing on every radio station in America, and walk away from it with enough money to cover 2 months' rent. Maybe. But it gets worse. Because Motown also charged artists for their own recording sessions. Every hour in the studio, every unreleased track, every session that got scrapped, that came off the artist tab. Gordy's system, borrowed deliberately from the Detroit auto industry he'd worked in, was designed so that costs were always being subtracted from earnings. The assembly line produced the product. The worker paid for the machine. The Jackson 5 are the sharpest example of how brutal this got. Their father Joe signed them to Motown in 1969, a 7-year deal, signed without full legal review. Buried in the contract was a clause stating Motown had no obligation to record or even promote the group for 5 years. Between 1969 and 1975, the Jackson 5 recorded 469 tracks. Only 174 were ever released. The rest, unreleased, and still charged to the group's account. When the Jacksons finally broke from Motown in 1975, they weren't just leaving, they were ordered to pay $2 million in damages for walking away from a deal that had underpaid them from the beginning. Now here's where you feel the full weight of this. Holland Dozier Holland, the songwriting trio who wrote Stop, In the Name of Love, Reach Out I'll Be There, Baby Love, How Sweet It Is, left Motown in 1967. The reason was royalty disputes. The architects of the Motown sound, the 3 people arguably most responsible for the label's commercial dominance, couldn't get a fair accounting of what they were owed. Gladys Knight tells a story that stays with you. Around the time she and the Pips were deciding whether to leave, they went to Motown's accounting department and asked to withdraw $3,000. Road money they'd already earned on tour, but hadn't collected. They needed it to pay their taxes. Motown told them the money wasn't there. No record of it. Gladys Knight, one of the greatest voices in American music, asking for $3,000 she had already earned, and being told it didn't exist. When they demanded their royalties, the label made them an offer, sign another contract, and Motown would pay their taxes for them. She wrote about this in her memoir. Her words were, "We weren't that desperate." They hired a lawyer and walked. Martha Reeves and 2 fellow Vandellas sued Motown in the 1980s for back royalties. 2 of the members later stated that at one point they had received no royalties from Motown going back to the 1960s. An entire decade of hits, Dancing in the Street, Nowhere to Run, Heatwave, and the claim was, nothing came back. The lawsuits weren't the exception. They were the pattern. Pattern interrupt, shift tone here, slow down. Here's what's important to sit with for a moment. None of this was technically illegal at the time. Music industry contracts in the 1960s were almost universally predatory toward artists. White-owned labels were doing the same thing, often worse. The broader theft of black music by white-owned industry is a decades-long story that deserves its own documentary. But Gordy knew that. Gordy had experienced that. He built Motown on the explicit promise that he was different from those labels. That's the thing that separates this from a story about a bad industry. This is a story about a man who knew exactly what he was doing, because it had been done to him. And what he did next made everything worse. By the mid-1980s, Motown was bleeding. The label that had dominated the charts for a decade was struggling to find its footing in a music landscape that had shifted underneath it. Hip-hop was rising. New wave was everywhere. The artists who had defined the Motown sound were aging, and the label hadn't developed a new generation to replace them. Gordy had been distracted. His focus through the late 1970s and early 1980s had drifted heavily toward film, specifically toward building Diana Ross into a movie star. Lady Sings the Blues, Mahogany, these were passion projects. And while Gordy was chasing Hollywood, the label's infrastructure was quietly deteriorating. He tried to sell before. In 1986, MCA had made an offer. Gordy got close enough that Stevie Wonder's consent had to be secured. Wonder had a rare contractual provision requiring his approval for any sale. His team negotiated a bonus payment of more than $3 million before agreeing. Then Gordy changed his mind. He pulled back. The deal collapsed. 2 years later, he was ready. On June 28, 1988, Berry Gordy sold Motown Records to MCA Incorporated and the investment firm Boston Ventures for $61 million. MCA contributed 20% of the purchase price. Boston Ventures put up the rest. The announcement came through a press release. That's how the artists found out. Not a meeting. Not a phone call. Not a conversation. A press release, the same document handed to wire services and newspaper reporters, was how the people who had built Motown discovered it no longer existed as they had known it. Gordy's official statement read, "It is in the nature of institutions to take on their own life and to outgrow the individuals who create them." Smooth. Corporate. Bloodless. There were, according to reports at the time, no Motown artists present at the announcement. The people who had given 30 years of their voices, their youth, their image, and their legal rights to this label were not in the room. Now let's talk about the number itself. Because $61 million sounds large. And for 1988, it was significant money, roughly $139 million in today's value. But it was already known, even at the time of the sale, that Gordy had undervalued the label. His own reported asking price had been $70 million. He settled for $61 million because, by his own later admission, he was tired. He wanted out. He'd had enough of the pressure. And 5 years later, 5 years, Polygram bought Motown from MCA for over $330 million. The same catalog, the same recordings, the same legacy built by those same artists was worth more than 5 times what Gordy sold it for, in less than a decade. The artists saw none of that appreciation. Not from the first sale. Not from the second. But here's what makes this even harder to sit with. Gordy didn't sell everything. When he sold Motown Records to MCA, he kept Joe Beat. Joe Beat Music Publishing, the company he'd founded in 1958 to hold the copyrights to Motown songs. The publishing arm that controlled the rights to nearly every hit ever recorded at Hitsville, USA. Think about what that means. Gordy sold the label, the part that needed management, staff, overhead, ongoing investment. And he kept the catalog, the part that simply generates money forever from every use of every song. He later sold portions of Joe Beat to EMI Music Publishing, in stages, between 1997 and 2004. The financial terms of those deals were never fully publicized. But EMI's acquisition of music publishing catalogs of that scale typically ran into the hundreds of millions. The artists whose voices are on those recordings, whose performances made those songs worth owning, received nothing from the Joe Beat sale either. Because under the contracts they had signed in that office on West Grand Boulevard, in the room, without a lawyer, they had already signed away their publishing rights. Decades earlier, as teenagers, without being allowed to take the paperwork home. And there's Michael Jackson. In 2003, Michael Jackson filed a lawsuit against Motown. The suit alleged that Motown and its successive owners had breached a settlement contract from 1980 that required the label to pay him royalties on pre-1976 recordings he'd made as a solo artist and as a member of the Jackson 5. The suit contained a sentence that is almost impossible to read without stopping. Neither Motown nor its successors in interest have provided Jackson with a single accounting or paid Jackson a single dollar in royalties. Michael Jackson, the biggest selling artist in music history. Formed on Motown. Launched on Motown. Shaped by Motown. Not a single dollar in royalties. Not a single accounting. The lawsuit was eventually settled. Terms undisclosed. As most of these things are. Because the music industry learned a long time ago that settlements are quieter than verdicts. Remember what we said in the beginning. Some of them were still waiting on royalty checks that were never coming. Now you know what that actually looked like. But who is actually responsible for this? Because the answer is more complicated and more damning than you might expect. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because it's easy to make Gordy the villain of this documentary. And in some ways, he earns that role. The contracts were his. The policy of no take-home review was his. The 2.7% royalty rate was his. The decision to sell without notifying the artists was his. Joe Beat, keeping the publishing rights while offloading the label, was his. But here's the question that matters more. Could any of this have happened without the artist's own choices? And the answer, as painful as it is complicated. Many of the Motown artists knew, at some level, that the deal wasn't fair. Some of them hired lawyers eventually. Some of them left. Holland Dozier Holland walked in 1967. Mary Wells left in 1964, the same year My Guy became her biggest hit. Gladys Knight left when they tried to leverage her taxes. Marvin Gaye fought Gordy personally for years. Their relationship was a war disguised as a partnership, culminating in Gaye eventually being bought out of his Motown contract by CBS Records in 1982 for $1.5 million. But many stayed. Many stayed for decades. And that's not weakness, that's something more structurally important. Because the alternative wasn't simply go to another label. In 1960s America, for a black artist, the alternatives were often worse. White-owned majors were stealing from black performers openly and without apology. Independent labels were unstable. Radio programmers were payola-driven. The infrastructure required to reach a mainstream audience as a black artist in that era was controlled by a system that was largely hostile to your existence. Gordy understood this. And this is the most damning thing you can say about him, he used it. He built Motown as a protective structure. A genuine one, in some ways. He fought for his artists' access to mainstream radio. He fought for their dignity in an industry that regularly degraded black performers. He created the crossover sound, not just for commercial reasons, but because he understood that crossover success was the only path to sustained cultural influence in that era. And then he made that protective structure into a trap. Because once you were inside Motown, once you had the choreography, the polish, the touring infrastructure, the songwriters crafting hits specifically for your voice, leaving meant losing all of it. You didn't just leave a label. You left an identity that the label owned. Gordy was explicit about this. In 1995, in an interview with journalist David Sheff, he said, "To exploit is not necessarily bad. I did try to control almost everything. It was my ball game, my vision, my dream." Many of those artists became superstars, but when they first came to me, they were just kids off the street who needed direction. Read that carefully. He used the word exploit. His word, not ours. His not apologizing. His rationalizing. His saying, "I made them stars, therefore what I took was fair payment." But here's what that argument misses, deliberately misses. He didn't just take a percentage of their earnings. He took the ownership of their work, their masters, their publishing, their group names in some cases. Motown retained naming rights to several acts, meaning that if a group left, they sometimes couldn't even perform under the name they'd made famous. That's not a management fee. That's not a record label deal. That's something closer to indentured creative servitude. And the $61 million sale is where it all crystallizes. Because in 1988, when Gordy sold the label, he wasn't just selling a business. He was selling the accumulated creative output of hundreds of artists, spanning 3 decades, captured in recordings those artists no longer owned, earning royalties many of them had never properly received, for a price that none of them were consulted on. He was, in the most literal financial sense, selling their work. Now step back further. Because Gordy didn't invent this system. He inherited it, recognized it, resented it, and then rebuilt it for himself. The music industry in America, from its earliest days, was built on the exploitation of black creativity. The specific machinery, unfair contracts, publishing rights seizure, royalty accounting manipulation, had been running for decades before Gordy touched it. He walked into a structure that was already designed to extract value from artists and concentrate it in the hands of owners. What makes Gordy uniquely significant and uniquely tragic is that he was supposed to be the correction. He was supposed to be the man who broke the cycle. And instead he mastered it. He became so good at the system he despised that by 1988, when he walked out with $61 million, Joe beat still in hand, artists still unpaid, he had outperformed the white-owned labels he'd once sworn to be different from. The real villain of this story isn't one man. It's a system so deeply embedded, so efficiently designed, that even the man who built his entire identity around opposing it ended up running it better than anyone else. That's not a small thing. That's the story of American music. So what does any of this mean? What are we supposed to do with the fact that the music we'll love came from this? What's left after the truth? Here's something that doesn't go away when the documentary ends. The songs still exist. Ain't No Mountain High Enough still plays at every graduation ceremony in America. My Girl still comes on the radio on a Tuesday afternoon and stops you in the middle of whatever you're doing. What's Going On is still one of the most perfectly constructed pieces of music ever recorded. That doesn't change. That can't be taken back. But knowing the truth about how those songs were made, who paid for them, in ways that go far beyond studio costs, that changes something about how you receive them. Not the beauty. The beauty is permanent. But the silence underneath the beauty. The names that should be on those royalty statements. The checks that never arrived. The lawyers' offices and the settlement terms and the accounting departments that claimed no record of $3,000 in already earned road money. That silence is part of the song now. You've heard it. You can't unhear it. Marvin Gaye once said of Martha and the Vandellas that they came closest to nearly saying something political. He said, when they sang Quicksand or Wild One or Nowhere to Run, they captured a spirit that felt political to me. He was right. But the politics weren't just in the lyrics. They were in the structure. In a group of black women performing for sold-out audiences across America, while two of them later testified they'd received no royalties going back to the 1960s. The performance was political. The invisibility of the payment was political. Now here's what changed and what didn't. The music industry, broadly, is still a machine designed to extract value from artists and concentrate it in ownership. Streaming has shifted the surface, but the structural logic is the same. The people who own the masters still hold the power. The people who own the publishing still collect while everyone else ages. What's different is visibility. Artists today, at least the ones with access to information, can see the contract before they sign it. They can take it home. They can have it reviewed. They can walk away if the terms are wrong. That sounds small. It isn't. For the artists who signed on West Grand Boulevard in the early 1960s, that basic right didn't exist. Not practically, even if it existed in theory. The artists who built Motown did not have that. And many of them spent decades, some of them their entire lives, trying to recover what had been taken through contracts they were never allowed to properly read. Mary Wells died in 1992. She was 49 years old. In the years before her death, she had been diagnosed with throat cancer and was, by multiple accounts, in serious financial difficulty. The woman whose voice launched Motown, whose My Guy was the label's first #1 pop hit, spent her final years struggling. She had been Motown's first superstar. When she left in 1964, Gordy reportedly got on his knees and begged her to stay. She left because the deal wasn't fair. And what came after wasn't easy. That's not a footnote. That's the cost. The artists who trusted that the dream was real, many of them paid for that trust in ways that lasted the rest of their lives. And the man at the center of it died in 2024, at the age of 93, celebrated as an icon, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, recipient of the National Medal of Arts from President Barack Obama, surrounded by the legacy of a label he sold decades earlier. Both things are true. The music was real. The exploitation was real. The dream was genuine. The trap was deliberate. And the $61 million, the number at the center of this whole story, that number tells you exactly how the math worked in the end. Gordy started with $800. He built something worth $61 million. 5 years after he sold it, it was worth $330 million. The artists who built that value between $800 and $61 million, they got 2.7%, split between all of them, after costs. The next time that song comes on, and it will come on, because those songs never really stop playing, maybe just sit with that for a moment. The music didn't cost what the label charged for it. It cost what the artists paid. And that bill was never settled.